I'm going to talk about a friend of mine, and lots of yours actually, Bob Cunningham, and I got some pictures. I don't know how to show you the pictures because there's one of them that's big enough you can see. Tom Bradley made that. That's the old guy is the smart guy, and the other guy, that would be me trying to get smarter. Put it on a piano. So this old man, Bob Cunningham, he was born in 1918, and a year before Bob got born, there was a sawmill in Slocan Valley. It was owned by the Patrick family. It was a big sawmill. It was in fact the first one in the interior that had burned its own waste to create steam to generate electricity to then operate the sawmill and create no waste. Almost 100 years have gone by and we've moved backwards quite a ways from how it was. But anyway, the Patricks, everybody here, they would pile up the wood in the tree farm license out Little Slocan all winter long, people living in camp, logging with horses, piling up the logs. And then they threw the logs in the river in the spring and they went down the river. And this one year, just before Bob was born, they lost control of the logs and they went all the way down the river and blew out a bunch of dams and stuff in the United States, and the Patricks went broke, which did two wonderful things. One is it created the National Hockey League because the Patricks went on to start the NHL and run a bunch of hockey teams and even play. And the other thing it did is create the opportunity for Bob's dad to buy the entire sawmill site. And so Bob was born onto what is now that farmland behind the store in Slocan Valley. His dad had bought all the homes of the Patrick family, 18 houses. They ran a farm and a store and a post office and rental houses. And Bob grew up into a wonderful community. His job was to deliver the, people would come to Slocan Valley and they'd buy their stuff. And then when Bob was old enough, they'd give him the horse and wagon and he would deliver the stuff all the way to Prairie Siding. And that was where Bob learned to be Bob, because of course he'd come to your house and he'd bring you your flour and the tools that you bought, and then he would sit at your kitchen table and chat for a while, leading to the guy that he became. Bob, this is so bizarre. I'm telling you a story about the finest storyteller that any of us ever met. He became a person in this valley who I would describe as a bridge. For those of you who never met him, he's a little bit shorter than me and he's a whole lot stockier, but he is like a bridge. He became the bridge between Japanese people and Anglo people, organizing baseball games, because that was one thing everybody was good at then. He became the bridge between the Russian community and the Anglo community. And then in the time that some of us moved here, he bent his body over again and became the bridge between families, long-time families here and the newcomers in the community. There's a million stories about Bob. He is a mythological character, one that is not true. It is not true that when the Sons of Freedom blew up the power leading to the Bluebell mine and the miners came to this valley to counterattack the people that had threatened their lives. It's not true that Bob stood in the middle of the road with a shovel and stopped that line of workers. At least,
never did that.
That's exactly what Bob said. Bob was alive, and people were telling stories about Bob and he about us. I came here, I guess I should back up. My dad was born in 1919, year after Bob, and my dad went through the Depression and gained politics and started having thoughts about who should run the world and who should not, and trying to cram the ideas into my head and teach me what he believed. But that relationship ended in early because he died when I was 21 years old. Bob, here in Crescent Valley, had 4 kids, one of whom had political interest, and Bob talked to that young man about who should run the world and who should not. And that young man died in an industrial accident. So here I come, 25 years old, and meet this guy who's got all this he wants to teach, and I got no dad, and this guy's looking for somebody to pass on his understanding of this place. I, of course, thought Bob was this haywire old truck driver who couldn't possibly have anything to teach me, and he thought I was this damn fool who would probably never learn. But at least I was mistaken. Okay, so Bob Cunningham drove truck and worked in sawmills here throughout the Depression, and attempted to organize how we live and create the conditions under which we exist today. And one of the stories he would tell is trying to create a union when they worked at Camp 10, back up behind this road right behind us here today. And he got it in his head that a bunch of people who all work together ought to be able to make a deal to get a certain amount of money, and he got to get people together and he said, okay, we want to get a certain amount of money, and then he learned lesson number 1 when he got fired that day and was sent home. And he didn't stop. He became one of the people who eventually created a union that actually could represent woods workers, presently called the IWA. He was one of those people who worked at West Kootenai Light and Power. I don't remember what they call it now. They sell it all the time. It's got a different name. There was a company here called West Kootenai Light and Power that built these dams, and he was working there as a millwright. And the workers were poor, and they got it in their head that if they put their money together and they looked after it together instead of putting it in a bank, then they could take care of one another. We call that a credit union today. And they thought, okay, well, let's get all our money. They got $27 and they put it together in the West Kootenai Light and Power Credit Union so that they could loan it to each other. And Bob gets there in the story, and they say, and then what happened, Bob? And he said, well, we lost the money, of course. And then what happened? Well, they got back together and they had $12. And they started credit union number 2 of West Kootenai Light and Power with the $12 that they had left. Bob was one of those, his dad was a liberal. I promised that there would be no politics, but how am I going to do that with a guy who essentially put it inside my head? So there'll be no partisanship, but there might be a bit of politics. His dad was a liberal, but then in the Depression, a bunch of Canadians got together and they started a thing called the CCF, and Bob was a young man, and he thought, this is the politics that I can relate to, this kind of social democracy thing. And so he became CCF. And then Canada decided that it wanted to build a whole bunch of dams and create a thing called the Columbia River Treaty. Well, the CCF, they were kind of agrarian people like Bob Cunningham. They believed in land and the power and wealth that comes from land, and not building dams and flooding the land, and so they opposed. And along came a new political party, the NDP, and they believed in jobs and creating industry, and they wanted to build the dams. And so the political party that Bob belonged to ran up against itself, and he was on the agrarian side, the CCF side. That led to the unwillingness of that political party to ever let him run for office. Except once, in the late 1960s, the New Democrats, the new party, was going to lose. Everybody knew they were going to lose. Wes Black was a cabinet minister, lived in Creston, and he was going to win. And so the New Democrats had a meeting in Salmo to decide who would be their candidate. But instead of there being 2 or 3 or 4 people buying and making speeches and everybody voting, 2 people were chosen to flip a coin. One was a guy who was a millwright in Nelson named Jack Monroe, and the other guy was Bob Cunningham. So he flipped a coin, and the rules of the deal was the loser had to become the candidate. Happily for Bob, he won. So Jack Monroe had to become the candidate, and Bob drove him around. Later, in the early 1970s, we were going to win, and Bob, our Social Democrat, wanted the job and actually put his hand up and ran for office. But of course he was on the wrong side. He was on the agrarian side, so they got a different guy who then became our MLA. Bob, I'll tell you the story about Jack Monroe in the IWA. In those days, the fight was over pensions for working people. And there was a big convention, and the IWA voted that they would put having pensions for woods workers on the negotiating table. And Bob, in spite of the fact that there's an entire hundreds of people in the room pounding the tables and they want to do this thing, Bob raises his hand and he says, you know, here's how it works in British Columbia. People don't buy trees from the government. The government establishes this thing called stumpage, and they take the selling price of the tree, then they deduct the cost, then they deduct profit, and the rest is how much they sell the trees for. If we working people get pensions for woods workers out of that difference, they're just going to take it out of the stumpage that all the other people have to live on. That runs the government. So he said, I move that we change our demand to pensions for every British Columbian instead of for ourselves. And of course he lost, but he never stopped saying it, because that was what was at the core of what Bob believed about this land base, is that it ought to take care of all of us. Over the years, he jammed enough stuff inside my head that made me into a candidate, and then we ran for office a bunch of times, and Bob wanted me, he had no interest in the strategy and the back rooms and the blah blah. He wanted me to understand the history of this place, where these people came from. He wanted to drive me up Wild Horse Canyon back behind Weimar and explain it to me. He wanted me to go up to Bob, what's his name's place up to Harrington's place up in Girard and introduce. He wanted me to understand the people who live here, and so the job that Bob volunteered for every single time there was an election was to be the driver to put the history inside my head. And we spent hundreds of hours together, and Bob had a price. If you win, which often we didn't, but if you win, Bob's price was, okay, then I get to tell you what you're going to do. It went on like this, 3 regional district elections and 2, 3, couple of provincial elections, and then in the middle 1990s somewhere, Bob started to be not well enough to live on his own in Slocan Valley. And the lovely people in this room realized that we needed some place for our own to stay. And Bob wasn't one of them eventually, but it was part of the impetus that created this building. And as the election of 1996 approached, Bob's condition deteriorated until he had to go and live in Mount St. Francis, and so along would come the first election in which my surrogate dad wasn't there. We started running for office, and somebody else was driving the car, and Bob's daughter, Marie, had come from Alberta to look after her dad, because he was actually dying. And she goes to his room in Mount St. Francis, and she's reading to him and talking to him and stuff. And finally Bob says to her, you know, Marie, this is all really nice what you're doing, but where I want to be is down there on Baker Street in the campaign, and I can't get out of bed. so you, Marie, who've never belonged to a political party and never worked on a campaign and don't know what you're doing, you got to go down there and volunteer and get the gossip and then come up every day and tell me what's happening. So this beautiful woman shows up there and says, I don't know anything about what's going on here, but I would like to help so I can go back and tell my dad what's... And so every day, I'd be running for office somewhere, and Marie'd be there, and then she'd go back up to the hospital at night, and she'd tell her dad what was happening. And then she'd report to me that her dad was deteriorating, but trying to stay alive to get to the end of the election, because it mattered what happened to Bob. And then it came the election day, and Bob's still alive, and then we won. And the next morning, I go up to Mount St. Francis, and he can't talk anymore, Bob. But I kind of think like this, this is a great end to a long relationship that we've had. And then Marie says, Bob's kind of nodding at Marie and pointing, and Marie says, well, Corky, Dad can't talk anymore, but he could talk a week ago. And he thought, in case you won, he wanted to write out a list. Bob's nodding his head. And so there's this letter. And I'm just the tiniest bit defensive because I think I'm done now, right? It's like I thought I'd done everything. Anyway, the gist of what Bob wanted, he had been a log truck driver in Crawford Bay, and often would leave home in Crescent Valley and go and get the ferry and go across and then spend a week hauling poles for KFP. And so he'd ridden on the Balfour and the Anscombe, and he knew all about, and in the letter it's like the Anscombe was built in this year and the motor was replaced in this year. It's like, and then the whole entire history of those two ships is in the letter. And then he says, and Corky, they're not going to last very long. And although nobody's built an inland ferry for 40 years, that's what you got to do. That's what we need. We need a ferry boat, and I want you to tell me that you'll do it. And I got to admit, in my ignorance, I had not ever thought of building a ferry boat. It almost killed the guy I worked for building ferry boats. I was, anyway, so a bunch of people got together. Bob passed away, and we built the Osprey, which we couldn't name after him because until today nobody really knew the story about why it was there. But I have a picture of this boat that Bob got built. This is the ship that Bob Cunningham wanted you guys to have, and I think it's cool that you can go ride it.
Who designed it?
It was designed by taking the one that goes to Salt Spring, chopping 40 feet off of it, giving it to Kootenai School of the Arts and saying, tart it up. I wanted to close by saying that because Bob was this bridge between communities, lots of stuff that would never have happened here got done because he brought people together and stopped them from tearing each other apart, both young people and older people, history and modern times, CCF, NDP, Russian, Anglo. And so because all of us were wrapped up in this guy's life, when Bob died, all of us had to be involved. It took 2 days to bury Bob because the various communities that we belong to had to have events in our own culture, in our own way. And after the 2 days in the Crescent Valley School, everybody came together to finish this celebration. And they decided to have the event in the hall and park the hearse at what used to be the police station all the way. He was the mayor of Crescent Valley. He'd been born there. He'd raised his children there. And so they wanted to carry him out of Crescent Valley. So the service was in the building, and when we came out of the service, somebody poked me in the shoulder and said, "Look up," and there's this eagle that's just flying overhead. And I've never seen an eagle in Crescent Valley. Everybody stopped and was looking up, and Bob was big, so Bob was heavy. So we started walking out of the hall and down the road in Crescent Valley, and it must have taken 100 people to carry that man through Crescent Valley. People kept changing because, of course, they wanted to be part of the thing, and also it was too heavy to walk very far. So everybody, and the whole time as we crawled our way through the village of Crescent Valley, there's this eagle flying overhead. And then when we get to the other end, there's this hearse, and the finest man that we knew, we put him in the hearse, and they closed the door, and the eagle flew away, and he left, except in your hearts. Thanks.